All right, so we got caught off and we are now back on the memory card finished, so here we go. So I'm gonna attach them together a little later on. So where was I? So pleasure. We say because we're talking about the fact that because you think of her you think about the relationship, how warm it was, friendly was, kind it was, comforting was, the intimacy, the love, the hugging, the cuddling and doing things, and the order that you have created together and all that, but you're mostly focused on the pleasure that you're receiving from that relationship in one way or another, then you're actually in pursuit of the pleasure. You only think about the pleasure rather than the actual things that were surrounding the pleasure part eventually. But there were so many other things that you had to deal with, interact with. The pleasure was part of it, but you don't see any of that. You only focus on the pleasure and everything else kind of disappears. And you're totally thinking that the relationship and the pleasure have the only reasonable explanation for that relationship is pleasure. You think the pleasure represents the relationship represents the pleasure, and nothing else was in there. So you're totally dogmatically focused on the pleasure and you see nothing else. Therefore, what's wrong with the pleasure? What's bad about pleasure? You cannot come up with anything bad about pleasure. Pleasure is what we are all after, right? Our whole life is set around pain and pleasure. And pleasure, everybody is attracted to it. You know, it's just, what is the word for it? Anyhow, everybody is gravitating toward pleasure. So when you think about that relationship as a source of pleasure, then you wouldn't care about anything else that was wrong about it because you don't see it. You're totally into the pleasure, which means you're actually worshiping pleasure. You have no understanding of what it was that you had a relationship with. You have a relationship with pleasure and you will do anything to get that. But pleasure is not necessarily, just because it makes you feel good, is good for you. You know, like people who are using drugs, if they focus on what drug is and what it does to them, they will not use it. But they're not focusing on what drug is. They're focusing on the pleasure that they receive from the drug. And many other things in life, if you focus on the value or the effect of whatever it is that you're doing to your life, to your health, to your being, instead of focusing on the pleasure part of it, then you wouldn't do it. You would at least judge and see, is this thing something I should be doing or not? But if you're only focusing on the pleasure of that action or that involvement, that interaction, that whatever it is, experience, then you're not really seeing if that experience, if that thing, if that action is something you should be involved in or not. You will only be focusing on the pleasure part and you're not noticing where the pleasure is actually taking you and what's the consequences of it. You're just focusing on that it makes me feel good. But many things could be making you feel good, but they're not necessarily good for you. Same thing in such relationship. If you focus on the pleasure, then you have no reason to think there's anything bad about it because it makes you feel good. But if you focus on what the source of the pleasure is and what it does to your life, what you're going through, then you will decide, if I want to be having anything to do with this kind of experience, this pleasure, or not, because its roots are here. And that, where the pleasure comes from, stems from, is not good for me, neither healthy nor helps me to advance or brings any positive effect to my life and so on and so forth. Then you'll be able to make the right decision. So, and the other thing is that why you can't move on is that we're always accustomed to dodge pain. In other words, we kind of try to kind of slip away where the pain comes. rather than actually, it's like we're afraid of dealing with pain, doing something about it to get rid of it, but we just are conditioned to just avoid it. If we avoid it as if we've dealt with it, but it's not. If you head on, go to see what is this pain about. You know, like when you have a stomach pain or something you can't get over, you go to the doctor. You go head on, deal with it. But if you keep avoiding it, okay, I won't eat this and I won't get a pain. Okay, maybe I have a pain, but it's not really bad. I can take it. You kind of try to avoid it, then it's not dealing with an issue. Same thing with the breakup. When the breakup happens, you try to say, well, you know, she was so nice, she was so wonderful, and you know, you try to justify that she's still good for you because she used to be good for you the way you guys were. And you're not dealing with the fact that, let me deal with it. Why is this pain there? The pain is there because she was doing this, I was doing this, we were not compatible, things had changed, we have changed, our consciousness had changed, her consciousness had changed. But you don't do any of that. You still focus on the good things about her so you can avoid the bad things that she was bringing into the relationship, or things that, the reasons that the relationship wasn't working out. So you were avoiding the problem, the pain, and you were focusing on taking refuge in the good part of it, so it would make you feel good. Because we run away from what doesn't make us feel good. And in a breakup, what makes you not feel good is the fact of facing with the fact that there's a breakup, that you guys were no longer compatible, that things were not really good. But instead you go into the good part of the memory that you have of that relationship and you cuddle there, and then you have a hard time to get away from it because you feel good. It makes you feel good, all those good memories. But you're not seeing the entirety of the things, hence you're constantly dodging the pain instead of head on, deal with it, see what is it, what was really happening here. When you see it, then say, no, I don't want that sort of stuff, because I don't want to deal with that. Relationship is supposed to be helping both of us to advance and become stronger, not constantly worry about what do I have to deal with it now, what discrepancies we have now, what conflicts and divisions, because conflicts and divisions are normal. We're all different consciousnesses, and that is part of who we are, and that is unavoidable. So if you think that way, you will think that there's no disaster happen. It's okay, it's normal. You can still have another relationship and of a better quality. Now, when something becomes the most important thing in your life, which often we make, you know, our girlfriends, our wives, or whatever it is that your relationship is, your partner, you make your wife, you make your girlfriend the most important thing that you desire, the most important thing in your life, the most important pleasure, the most important person. You make her to be. Why? Because in fact you're you know, paying homage to yourself. You're making yourself feel great by thinking of her as, you know, that she's amazing, great, this and that. You're actually complimenting yourself, because it was me, she's mine, and if I want to be great, then I have to think of her as great. That means I have a really great person, which makes me, I must be great to have such a great person. So you're really, really buttering up yourself when you really make her that big. But when you do that, when you actually make her that amazing person, angelic in the world in your mind, and you condition yourself for a few months or a few years, then when things don't work out and she change, which we all do change, you have a hard time to accepting it. Because then, how could such a great person be this, or change this, or not be as great as I used to think? And also, you just simply think, if you have made her to be the greatest thing in the world, when it breaks up, the relationship, you think then you have lost the greatest thing in the world, which the effect of it would be devastating. When you make something to be that important, when things are not the same anymore, you guys break up, you lose it, then you think you lost